So yeah, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meetup where we will talk about security requirements management. And the goal is to give you a brief introduction about how you can define appropriate security requirements and which aspects you have to consider when you deal with security requirements. My name is Daniel Schwarz. I work as a Senior Security Analyst at Condignum here in Vienna. And I actually spend a lot of my working time defining security requirements for specific use cases and challenges, which then get distributed via our Condignum platform, which is more or less a software as a service product. Besides that, I also work part-time as a lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences in St. Pölten, and I teach web application security there. So the agenda for the next half an hour will be, we will talk a little bit about requirements in general, so a quick introduction. We will then discuss the three, in my opinion, most important steps to successful security requirements management. And then I will give you a little quick start guide how you can start dealing with security requirements within your own company. And then we will finish with a few key messages. So let's dive right into it. What is a requirement actually? A brief look in the dictionary tells you it's something wanted or needed. So a requirement in the end just defines what our product should be able to do. And in order to define good requirements, they need to meet a few different properties and attributes, like they should be prioritized, they should be verifiable, traceable, they should be clear and unambiguous, and so on. But in the end, they just define what something should do. And as Thomas already mentioned in the introduction, there are actually two different types of requirements. On the one hand, we have functional requirements. Those are the requirements which really define what the product should be able to do like feature-wise. So which features should this product have? If our product is, for example, a web browser, then one of the main functional requirements would be that this web browser can display websites to the users, for example. And of course, the primary focus of the customer, and therefore the project leads and of course the developers, is on these functional requirements, because they are the reason why we even want to have this product. On the other hand, there are non-functional requirements. For example, things like extensibility or scalability or maintainability, usability, and so on. I think you get it. Those are very important attributes to operate and maintain a high quality product, but nobody wants a product just because of them. And that's actually also the main problem here, because security is one of the, in most cases, one of those non-functional requirements. And while the customer primary focuses on the functional requirements, the non-functional requirements are also important somehow, hopefully. But the customer doesn't really see them, and therefore he's not really willing to pay a lot of money for them. So it's often really, really hard to get the money for those non-functional requirements. And but still everybody just takes them for granted, right? Because of course it should be secure and of course it should be usable, but they aren't done by themselves. So this is a pretty bad issue we have with non-functional requirements in general and also with security. But why do we even need it? Why do we need security? Nobody wants that a hacker is successful in doing harm to our products and our business. So we want to meet the classic protection goals like confidentiality, availability, integrity, and privacy. And to meet these protection goals, we just need an appropriate level of security. How do we get that? Or yeah, we need a specific level of security. And the thing is, the later we deal with the security topics, the more expensive it's gonna be in most cases. So if you just discover in production or at your acceptance testing that you have severe security issues, it will be pretty hard and expensive to fix them, because maybe you have to restructure your whole application, your whole system. But if you deal with security or consider security right in the beginning of your development process, then it's in most cases pretty easy to implement them. So yeah, the requirements management phase is one of the very first in the beginning, right next to the design and the architecture phase. So if we consider the security topics right in the beginning, it will be much, much cheaper in the long run. So if we want to do security requirements management, what does that mean? There are actually 3 different steps, which are, in my opinion, the most important ones here. At first, we have the requirements engineering. So we just need to know what are our security requirements and how can we define them. Then we need to implement them and need to document them. And afterwards, we have to verify if we did a good job and implemented them correctly. So let's have a look at the engineering part. When we want to define our security requirements, there are actually a few different sources where they can come from. On the very top, there are regulatory obligations. For example, laws like the GDPR or industry regulations like PCI DSS or similar things like that. And here's an example of 2 security requirements directly from the PCI DSS, which is a regulation for the credit card payment industry. And those requirements, for example, say protect shared cardholder data or develop and maintain secure systems and applications. So you see, those requirements are really pretty high level and very generic, right? So it's hard to deal with them. On the next layer, we have requirements from our stakeholders. So for example, our customers, partners, and so on. Some of them really do know what they want in terms of security and give you very detailed requirements, but most of them just go like, yeah, well, it should be secure, and of course it should be secure. I want to have state-of-the-art software, and it just has to be secure somehow. I don't want to get hacked. So even in most cases, even more generic than the regulations. So in the end, it all comes down to our own business requirements, the security requirements we define in our own company. And there's the big question, how can we do that? So if we want to define our own ones, we have also a few sources which we can use to derive the appropriate security requirements. One possible source will be our internal policies. For example, the information security policies or the compliance policies and so on. You can just go through them and can think about what does it really mean for my development process, for my product development, and which requirements can I derive from that. Another important source can be previous incidents and security audits performed within your company. So you can have a look at those reports and learn from the mistakes from the past and derive appropriate requirements from them. We can, of course, hire some external security consultants who just tell us what we need to do. And we can also use external sources like external requiremms catalogs, for example, from the OWASP project or from the Center for Information Security or things like that. Then there's a technique called threat modeling. I hope most of you already heard about that. This is a very effective technique, which results in a lot of different security requirements. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of knowledge, but I can really recommend it to you to try it out. And yeah, I also did a talk about how to start with threat modeling here at SBA Research about a year ago. And I think you can still find it if you just Google for SBA Research Threat Modeling 101. And this will give you a little start, an introduction how you can do threat modeling on your own. And of course, there are also a few tools out there which can help you defining your own security requirements. And I'm sure there are many, many more possible sources. But for me, in my experience, those are the most important ones where we can get a lot out of it. If we define our security requirements, we can do this on different levels of detail and abstraction. So on the very top, we can have generic requirements. As we already saw from the PCI DSS example before, they can protect stored cardholder data. It's really generic, and as we said, pretty hard to deal with it. So my recommendation is to take such generic requirements and break it down into more detailed technology-independent requirements. For example, this requirement here can be broken down into cardholder data must be encrypted at rest, and it must be encrypted in transit, and every login to the system must be secured with two-factor authentication, and so on. You can, there can be a lot of different detailed requirements to achieve this goal, this generic goal. And if you've done that, there is also a third level, which we call the technology-specific requirements, or actually it's an extension for the requirements, because you can just extend those technology-independent requirements with technology-specific details, like, for example, coding examples in the different languages you use in your company. Of course, this is not really a requirement anymore, because, as we said in the beginning, a requirement defines what to do and not how to do it. But I think it's still a pretty good idea to do that, because it just gives the developers, more. You can guide the developers in a more specific way, so they get a better idea how they can possibly ensure those requirements. Of course, the more detail we give to each requirement, the more effort we have to put in this whole requirements engineering process. And if this is a good idea or not, really depends on the skill level, on the security skill level of your developers. So if most of the developers in your team don't have a lot of security know-how, then I think it's a good idea to put a lot of effort into the requirements engineering process to really have detailed requirements and also guidelines how to possibly fulfill them. If you have really skilled people in terms of security, then it's also okay to have pretty generic requirements, because they will understand them and they will act accordingly. So on this axis, we can achieve an appropriate level of security. On the other hand, if our people don't have a lot of skill and we also don't put a lot of effort in the security requirements engineering, we will end up most probably with not so secure products, and yeah, cannot really recommend that. And to have the best skilled people and also engineering really detailed requirements would be, of course, the best case, but is also some kind of utopia because nobody really will invest that amount of money. So yeah, that was a quick overview how you can possibly derive your own security requirements and on which levels you can do that. And when we have that, then we need to implement that and or them. And a really important factor here is documentation, because we need some kind of documentation for two things. At first, we need to make the requirements available to all the developers in the first place. Otherwise, they cannot implement them. And of course, we also want to have them confirming that they implemented them, either for our internal project management or our internal compliance, as well as maybe for external proof or something. So it's really a thing to define the appropriate detail level for the documentation here. And this, of course, correlates directly with the documentation effort and depends again on the skill level. So if the skill level of my people is very high, then it's maybe enough to just have a list of security requirements, of generic ones, and to publish them within a company-wide policy or something like that. Everybody commits himself to stick to those requirements, and everybody will do fine. But if the security know-how of my team is not that well, then it's maybe better to break down the company-wide requirements to the very specific requirements for each project, and maybe put them in the acceptance criteria and the definition of done, or in a kind of project handbook or something like that, because then it's just closer to the developers and is better available for them. And if the skill level is even lower, then I would really recommend to pick the appropriate requirements for each work package. So maybe for each sprint, or even better, really for each user story. So you can, for example, attach the necessary requirements to each user story via some Jira subtasks or something like that. So each developer will know when he starts a new user story, he will be completely aware of the concrete or specific requirements which are important for this work package. So yeah, depending on these attributes, you just have to decide how much documentation effort you want to invest and on which level you anchor your requirements. After that, we really need to implement them and to write code. And of course, like always, it's all about the money. We have a specific amount of implementation effort to implement our requirements, and we have a defined budget. And in a best case scenario, there would be enough budget for all our functional requirements and the non-functional ones. In a pretty okay case, there would be just enough budget for most of the functional requirements, and we could give the non-functional ones kind of a best effort shot. But in the usual bad case, as we all know it, there's just not enough budget, not even for the functional requirements, and of course not at all for the non-functional ones, and so also for security. And therefore, prioritization really is key here. So if you have your security requirements, try to think about how much security gain does every requirement give you, and how much effort is it to implement them. And then try to make a prioritization, which one is really important and which ones should be done first. So you get the really important things done. In the last minutes, we talked a lot about high effort. Of course, if you want to do something, we have to put effort in it. But of course, this high effort can also get reduced a little bit. We talked about 3 different categories which generate effort. It was the requirements engineering, so the definition of requirements, the documentation, so actually the handling of the requirements, and the real implementation. And if we think about how we can reduce them, for the engineering, I can really recommend you to use catalogs, like requirements catalogs from different sources. As I said before, there's, for example, from OWASP, there is the Application Security Verification Standard, ASVS, which has, I think, about 300 different requirements for secure web development. And you can just use these catalogs, for example, and pick those requirements that fit your needs and create your own company internal standardized catalog, which is just right for you. And of course, you can also use some tools to help you faster definition of your requirements. And if it comes to documentation, you will absolutely need some kind of tooling. In this most simple case, it could be an Excel sheet where you track where you track all your requirements and their status, or it can be some kind of Jira workflow, or it can even be some other task and requirements management tool. But you will need some support to keep track of all those things. And when it comes to implementation, of course, the most important thing are very high skilled people. So investment in security know-how is really important and can help to speed up things. At least for the prioritization, of course, tools can also help you. So there are tools which can help you with that. And if your people use those tools, of course, they can also learn from it and improve their security knowledge. And actually, that's also what we at Condignum try to provide for our customers. Our platform gives you the appropriate security requirements for your individual current use case. It gives you the possibility to manage the requirements in your teams and to document the implementation. And it gives you a prioritization recommendation based on our own expert experience. Yeah, so we now know our requirements. We have implemented them. And in the last step, we need to verify them. Because a good requirement also should be verifiable. If you cannot verify that a requirement is met, then the requirement, is pretty crap. So the verification should always happen as early as possible. In the best case, directly within each sprint. Because remember, we talked what we said in the beginning, the later you deal with security problems or security concerns, the more expensive it's going to get. So if you directly evaluate after each sprint, it will be pretty easy to fix bugs. And also very important is to update your requirements based on your previous verification results. So always try to learn from what you already did. Good. So now I come to the little quick start guide. So if you do not deal with any security requirements in your company yet, then I would recommend you to start by collecting all this generic stuff, which is already right there somewhere, like the regulations that apply to you and the things that your stakeholders want from you, and also the internal policies which are around in your company somewhere. And then research some external catalogs. Like I said, for example, have a look at all the OWASP stuff or the stuff from the Center for Internet Security, things like that. And also have a look at all the reports from previous incidents or security audits within your company. And then really try to extract an internal catalog for your company with the security requirements you can derive from those sources. And if you have that, try to integrate it as seamlessly as possible in your current development process. As a starting point, it could be a good idea to just add them to your list of acceptance criteria. Or a little bit more advanced, but very effective, try to set up a dedicated meeting before your sprint planning. And in this meeting, you try to identify which requirements from this catalog are relevant for this current or for the next sprint, and or even for each single user story in this sprint. And yeah, then it should be possible to implement them in a quite efficient way. But how you really do this is one recommendation which I saw at different customers, which worked pretty good. But in the end, it really depends on how your teams work, how your process works, and so on. So just try to adapt it and integrate it as seamlessly as possible in your existing process. Or, of course, you can also give our platform a try and see if it helps. Yeah, I think so. Okay. That leaves me with my 3 key messages for this short talk. Number 1, well prioritized non-functional requirements are really worth their money in the long run, especially for security requirements, because someday a bad hacker will try his luck and nobody wants him to be successful. So better take care of it early, where it's still cheap to do it, and not later on during production when it's really hard to change things. Number 2, if you have less security know-how in your team, then it's even more important to have more specific requirements and more detailed documentation. So you should at least either invest in one, so the security education, or in the other. And number 3, just make use of all those tools and resources which are already out there, because you don't have to and you cannot just invent everything on your own. Life's just too short for that. And this is also true for security requirements. Yeah, that's actually it. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them as good as possible.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. We have 3 questions from the audience, and I also have a question afterwards, or 2. So let's start with the questions from the audience. Hopefully is asking, shouldn't requirements not always be specific for validation by testers? Because if you don't state the level of security, you most probably get the weakest, easiest to implement. So how to deal with this?
I don't know if I really got. Can you repeat it once more?
So I understand it like if the developers themselves they define the security requirements, they will go for the easiest path. And they will say, let's just do those 2 security requirements and the others don't matter.
Ah, okay. Yeah, of course. Of course, it's from a from a company perspective, it's not a good thing if the really the developer himself defines the requirements for him. It's better than having nothing, of course, but it would even be better to define the this overall requirements catalog on let's say a higher level or a project independent level, and then the responsible persons, like for example a security architect or the architect of a project, can pick the relevant requirements for the specific project. Mm-hmm. And also when I talked about this meeting you can have, for example, to map the requirements to single sprints or single user stories, it's very good to do that as a whole group. So the architects and lead developers and so on should be within this group, and together you can decide, okay, for this and that user story, those requirements are really important.
Mm-hmm. I'm not too sure if that question was, I understood it right, Gottfried. If that was not the question, please just ask another one. You were talking about, Daniel, about user stories, and there's one question by Philip. What's your opinion on defining dedicated security user stories?
Yeah, it's the same thing with all non-functional requirements, right? Some people like to do dedicated sprints where they just deal with the with reworking and eliminating technical depths, or making a product more modular or something like that. And the same is with security. In some teams, they don't want to hear about sprints that have no, or even user stories that have no functional requirements in it, because some Scrum gurus say every user story needs to have something visible for the user. In my opinion, as a security guy, it's totally fine to have such user stories or even such sprints.
If the data doesn't get hacked, that's something visible, indirectly visible as well.
Where that's true.
In the other case,
that's true. But I saw at some customers that it can be really effective to, for example, say, okay, the next sprint is our security sprint, and we will eliminate all the depths we have from previous pen tests or something like that. And it can even be like in this case, you can say, okay, we will now really deal with covering this and those security requirements. So
and putting those at a point in time where there is no the next major release right up front, but maybe some time in between.
Yeah.
But because right before the releases, the functional requirements also will always get prioritized over non-functional.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And yeah, I think a lot of Scrum guys or project managers will not agree with me, but in my opinion, it's totally fine if your team works that way, that you also define some user stories just for security.
Mm-hmm. Another question was, you're focusing very hard on Scrum in this. How would you go about implementing this in a Kanban flow team working on a legacy application?
I do focus a lot about Scrum because it's just one of the most common methods out there nowadays for agile development. If you have not so agile method, then it's most of the time actually even easier, because then you will have periodical phases where you refine your requirements, and this is the this is just the time where you also should think about the security requirements and plan them accordingly in your Kanban board, for example.
Mm-hmm. Herbert is asking a question as well. What would be, based on your experience, the best way in terms of who takes care to make sure that security requirements are really collected and then taken up in the project? So who will take up the end responsibility for it?
Again, I know this is not very satisfying, but again, it really depends on how your organization works and how your organization is structured. At one customer, for example, we defined a role which was called security architect. So this guy was responsible for security in a project, in a software project. And so this guy was also the one who cared about to collect the right requirements, because in the end, it would be his fault if something was missing. So, of course, this can also be the kind of product owner or project lead or something like that, or even maybe someone above them. So if you have if you're a small company and you have, for example, one guy who is responsible for security, then also this guy can be the one who just makes sure every project did this right. Mm-hmm. Now, in a big company, of course, this cannot be done by a few single centralized persons, but you will have to you will need some persons directly in the project teams to make sure that this happens.
So I think in an ideal world, it would just be yet another requirement that needs to be fulfilled, and the end responsibility is an product owner or whatever. But there might be some person that is in charge of defining them and maybe do some technical advisory on the people who are going to implement it, because they have the security focus. But I guess in an ideal world, it's just yet another requirement.
Yeah, actually true, yeah.
Category it is, right?
Yeah.
There was another question from Thomas, who will give a talk about this at Sec4Dev.
Thomas Cover, hi.
So that one, I guess. Hey, Daniel, do you see any significant differences between specifying security requirements for the internal development team versus creating security requirements for vendor contracts, so externally developed software? He's probably gonna include the answer in his talk at Sec4Dev.
I think in the end, not really. If you, of course, you can take the easy role and just do as many others else and just say, I want secure software, and you are my vendor, please make it secure somehow, and it's your problem how to do it. But if you're really security aware and you want to act proactive, then I think it's a good idea to also define the security requirements, or to don't make a difference between your internal security requirements and the requirements you have for your vendors. So I think it's completely nice to just give them the same requirements you would give your own people. Mm-hmm. Of course, you have something like, you can bind them to some contracts that they are maybe liable if something happens or something like this. But I think the nicer, or in security terms, cooler way would be to measure with the same standards here.
Mm-hmm. I have a question as well, because I also deal with security requirements. I do penetration testing and security reviews and so on. So what I see a lot is that, for example, one customer some time ago, they said, we want to put security requirements into our requirements documents. We want that security plays a role in there. So their first step was to include the whole, I repeat, the whole application security verification standard. So each and every point in there. And they told the external vendors that they should implement all of those points. So if they would have done that, they would have cost 10 times more.
Yeah.
My rough estimation. So people sometimes they go from 0 to 100 and they don't see the stuff in between. What's your point of view? What should I have said? What should I have done? What you can tell such people that it's not one extreme or the other? What's your approach on this?
Yeah, I think this is the thing. What I mean with take those catalogs and pick out those requirements which are really important for you and also really meet your requirements. Because as you said, like the ASVS, it's just huge. And if you give it to a development team, and tell them just implement all these 300 security requirements, then they will just don't know where to start. So I think it's really important to think about the prioritization. So to analyze those requirements and think about, on the one hand, what is the real security gain of a requirement, and on the other hand, what is the effort needed to implement it, and then kind of try to find a balance which requirements are worth it to tackle and which are maybe not, or really with a very, very low priority. And if you define, let's say for a software product, about 20 to 40 or maybe 50 security requirements, that's still really a lot. And it's, in my opinion, this is more than enough, and the product will have a very good security level if you implement them correctly. So it don't need to be such a huge catalog with 300 different requirements.
So two more questions, one by Gottfried again, not related to the first one. Do you think it's a good idea to seek for external certifications in case you are a vendor? For example, if you are in the health sector, HIPAA, US-based law for medical products, or payment in the PCI DSS, is this worth the effort?
I think so, yes, because you will save yourself a lot of trouble. If you don't have the certifications, you have to discuss with each and every customer again and again, because they just want to have, especially in these sensitive areas, they want to have some kind of proof, and not every customer can verify the security of the products himself. Maybe they don't have the resources or whatsoever, and such certificates are, yeah, a good, let's say, proof that you did your homework in terms of security. Yeah. So in my opinion, it's actually a good thing, because of course such a certificate doesn't say that you're 100% secure, of course not, but it at least shows that you considered security, and that you thought about it, and that you did something. And yeah, it's actually more than a lot of others do.
Yeah, I think for the payment industry, there's also the PADSS, the Payment Application Data Security Standard. PCI DSS is certifying a certain environment, a certain already there environment, and there's the Payment Application Data Security Standard, where you can certify your application. That's a standard software that can be installed on different sites. So you can certify what's the application part, and then the certification process is going to be much quicker, because you don't have to certify the application itself anymore, but only its environment. So that would be, I think, an option if you process credit card data, for example. There's another question by Alex. Hi, Daniel. Do you have any recommendations for a tool? I think he has a recommendation, which supports security requirements, engineering, managing on a larger scale, maybe even with support for importing and tracking them in, for example, Jira?
Yeah, as Thomas said, of course, I have a clear recommendation, our Condignum platform, because we actually do exactly that. There are, of course, a lot of other tools which do similar things. So on the one hand, you have the classic threat modeling tools, like, for example, Iris Risk, or also free stuff like the threat modeler, which give you kind of your threats and the things that can go wrong, and you can derive your security requirements from them. Then you have all this risk management tools and GCR tools, which also give you a lot of guidelines for all this compliance and risk stuff, and you can also derive requirements from there. And there are also a lot of different tools which just help you organizing stuff, like different task managing tools and things like that. But most of them don't really give you exact security requirements and say, yeah, for this use case, like developing an application in Java which does this, this, and that. Here you go with those 20 security requirements. Most of the tools don't do that, and this is a gap that we at Condignum really try to fill here. So we want to give you the appropriate security requirements for your special use case. Without the need for external consultants, actually.
Cool. So that's it with questions. Thank you very much, Daniel, for being part of this again at this meetup. Hope to see you again with other topics.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. That's it for today. Have a nice evening. And we will do what we would do if it was a physical meetup. We will have a beer.
Enjoy. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.